Hey everyone, welcome. We're going to begin in just a couple minutes. Um, give a sec for people to join, but if you'd like to introduce yourself in the chat with your name and your org or location, that'd be great. All right, guys, I think we'll go ahead and get started, but keep adding your name and org or location into the chat, and we're going to dive right in. So welcome. Uh, I really appreciate everyone making the time to join us today. We're really excited to do a little debrief of our experience with the Global Plastics Treaty meeting last month. Before we dive in, though, I'm just going to quickly do a little bit of housekeeping. Uh, so, oops, there we go. So if you want to go ahead, for now, I know people introducing themselves in the chat, but continue to use the chat to dialogue, any comments in there. If you do have questions as we get into the content, feel free to use the Q&A tool to add your questions in there, and we'll make sure we get to them in the discussion portion of today's session. And our team will be monitoring both. And yeah, so we're going to dive in. First of all, I'm Lucy Mullany. I'm the Director of Policy and Advocacy at Eureka Recycling, and I also serve as the National Policy Director for the Alliance for Mission-Based Recycling, or AMBR. And we were fortunate enough to send a pretty good team to the meeting in South Korea last month. And we have those team members on the call today. They're going to give us a debrief of what happened in South Korea and kind of what we can expect in the coming year. So I'm going to go through, introduce the speakers, and then we're going to do just a really short presentation, but the meat of today's session is going to be discussion, and we really encourage you to ask any questions that you have on your mind. So we have Katie Drews, who is our CEO, co-president at Eureka Recycling here in the Twin Cities. And Katie also serves as the national director of AMBR. And then we've got Alex, who is also a founding member of AMBR and is director of business development with Recycle Ann Arbor. And then Martin, who is also a founding member of AMBR and executive director of Ecology Center. So with that, I'm going to pass it off to Alex to do a little bit of an overview of who AMBR is and some of our background. So go ahead, Alex.
Thanks so much, Lucy. You can go to the next slide. Great. So yeah, the orgs in AMBR are the pioneers of recycling, starting back when recycling was really a community-led movement driven by a commitment to protect the environment and human health. So it was really a grassroots effort that was really focused on environmental impact, whereas today it's really become a lot more about waste management and dominated by the multinational organizations. So AMBR really represents kind of the beginning of recycling and the pioneers that have continued to innovate on this until today. Many of the AMBR orgs were the first recycling programs in their states. Some were the first in the country. And we've all operated programs, for close to 50 years. And go to the next slide. I'm sorry, you already went there. So, well, the methods and technologies we've used have evolved. moving from, volunteers collecting materials in old school buses to what we do today with unionized labor crews and state-of-the-art robotics. The why we recycle really remains unchanged, and that's to keep our natural resources in the ground where they belong and prioritize sustainable systems that benefit people and the planet. Like I said, we're all recycling operators that manage operations. This includes material recovery facilities, or MRFs for short. Then this is where recycling is sorted and prepared to be shipped to end markets that use that material to make new products. So this operational experience gives us a unique perspective, a view from the pile, we call it, where we have all this material that piles up every day, and we really understand the impacts firsthand of policy changes and what they have on our day-to-day operations, including our material streams. So we're experts in this mechanical recycling, and it gives us, a really amazing perspective, and we know where your water bottle goes. So it's it's an important part of the conversation. We're also all mission-based organizations. So our shared broader vision of eliminating the use of fossil fuels informs our recycling operations. And our goal in recycling, as always, is to capture material to keep it in circulation and reduce the demand to extract new materials. So we're manufacturing feedstocks for producers. We're not managing waste. And this goal goes back to the roots of the movement and our organizations as founding principles. And I think that's it for that section.
Thanks, Alex. I'm going to pass it to Katie to talk about what it means to say that we are committed to zero waste.
So this is the zero waste hierarchy. It's a framework that helps us to prioritize all the various efforts that go into reducing waste and conserving resources. And it's really not about managing waste. It's really about rethinking the systems that create waste in the first place. And so this hierarchy prioritizes systemic solutions over quick fixes, and stopping waste before it ever starts. So focusing first on reducing what we consume and reusing what we already have before we ever get to recycling or composting. It pushes for designing products and systems with longevity and reparability in mind, and minimal resource use in mind. So we're not just solving today's problems, but we're preventing tomorrow's. And while recycling plays a really important role, it's not the solution. It's not the one-stop shop solution. It's really a step on the path. And so reducing consumption and finding ways to keep materials in use for as long as possible should always come first. We also understand that people have really differing opinions about recycling and whether it's effective or equitable or enough to address the challenges we face. And here's kind of our take on that. And it's really informed by the reality of what we see coming through our facilities every day as recycling operators. And we see recycling as a bridge strategy. It's a crucial part of the process as we work towards systems that prioritize reduction and reuse, and helps us move to a future where waste is minimized and materials and products and packaging are used and designed thoughtfully and responsibly. If you want to go to the next slide. Recycling does work, not for everything, but for some things. Again, recycling isn't the solution, but it does work quite well for certain materials such as paper, metals like aluminum and tin, and glass. These materials have really well-established markets. They're high in demand, and they have proven recycling processes that allow for them to be efficiently and effectively transformed into new products. About 80% of the materials we see coming through our facilities are paper, glass, and cans and tins. So in all, maybe under 15%, somewhere between 10 and 13% are plastics. And that's really where recycling becomes challenging and problematic. Plastics are far more diverse in composition, design, and structure. And then they have multiple types of chemical variations as well. So this really complicates the recycling process. Only a small fraction, I'm sure everyone has heard this, only a small fraction of plastics are recyclable. And the vast majority of plastics outside of the ones and which are PET, the single-use water bottles and soda bottles, and then number two, high-density polyethylene, which are like your detergent and soap bottles. Those are the ones that have the infrastructure, the demand, and the end markets. And so what you're putting into your bins, the material that is approved by your local programs, those are being recycled. But outside of those, the vast majority are not recyclable. And then add to that, toxicities and additives that, plastics often contain, dyes and other contaminants that can complicate the recycling process, and then also pose risk to human health and the environment. And the sheer volume of plastics produced, much of it in the form of single-use packaging, continues to flood our systems and continues to make processing them very challenging. Next slide. So as recyclers, our focus is on packaging, especially the single-use plastic packaging. It's really rooted in our, what we call our view from the pile. It's really unique, and our expertise as recyclers. This is where we see the most significant and immediate challenges in the recycling system, and in the waste stream, and the broader impact on communities. And so we see this as addressable. These are addressable issues. Packaging is where an area of real change is possible, unlike some other forms, maybe like durable goods or those within healthcare and all that. But there are toxic concerns. So the issues goes beyond volume, and much of this packaging contains harmful chemicals that leach into our food and beverages and the environment, and pose significant health risks. And again, just the sheer diversity of packaging and the proliferation of packaging, there's too much, and it really does overburden our systems. I think that is mine. Yep.
Great, thanks, Katie. So I'm going to pass it to Martin, who kind of, given that kind of where we're coming from in that space, kind of why we're showing up at the Global Plastics Treaty and what it is.
Yeah, so the Global Plastics Treaty, we talk about it in their jargon. It's an international mechanism, or a tool. It's sort of pre-treaty. And what happened was about a little over 2 years ago, through the UNEA process, the United Nations, there was a call to negotiate a global plastics treaty with the understanding that the problems that we're facing can't be solved by any one country, and that a global response is necessary. And so they drafted some very, surprisingly strong language at that UNEA meeting, calling for 5 meetings of this international negotiating committee, which is basically all the member states of the United Nations, to come together, send delegations and come together in 5 meetings to hammer out a internationally binding instrument to address plastic pollution, and including in the marine environment. And we just had the 5th one, and they did not come to agreement on treaty language. So, the way these things work, and there are lots of international treaties on all kinds of things, but in the environmental space, the way they've worked is that there is an international negotiating process, and a treaty language is adopted. That then gets sent back to each member nation for ratification. And once a minimum number of countries sign on officially, get it approved in their home country through whatever process they use at home. Here, it's got to get through the Senate and be signed by the president. Then those member parties come together as a conference of party, or COP. So you might have heard of the climate COP, and they're on COP. I don't even know what number anymore, but those meetings then happen with some periodicity, some frequency, and they update, they fill in the gaps, they add amendments. They check in on enforcement and other stuff. So where are we in the process on plastics? Well, we're on a very accelerated pace. Some of these treaties have taken a decade to negotiate, or certainly 5, 8 years. They were trying to get it done in 2 with 5 meetings. We've used up all of that. They did agree. They almost disagreed to agree. That's the thing. But they did agree to an INC 5.2, because if they go to INC 6, it gets kicked back to the UNEA process, and the foundational language, the framework language that holds it all together, could end up getting renegotiated. Anyways, all that to say, we're still very much in the process, and it's been very slow going, and we've had a lot of maneuvering by the major oil producing nations, oil dependent nations, in sort of derailing the process and slowing it down. And so got a lot of work left to do, and we'll get into some of that in the Q&A. From an AMBR perspective, we think of plastics treat, why are we there? Well, obviously the stuff trickles down, unfortunately, to our piles. And what's designed, what's in, what's out. And we see, as Katie was talking about, we see, plastic is trashing recycling. It's causing us a lot of headaches, a lot of costs. A lot of stuff gets put in the bin that isn't recyclable, and the plastic producing companies want to keep telling people that all that's recyclable and have us deal with it. So for us, we want to use the treaty to hopefully achieve some policy goals, but also it's the place where these conversations about plastic, the future of plastic pollution, plastic recycling, that's where they're all happening. And it's the same conversation happening there as is happening at the national level and is happening in each of our state legislatures. So, and it's a lot of the same players showing up to all these things. So it's just a really important space for us to be in and telling our truth and seeking our goals. Ultimately, we want to see a significant reduction in plastic production. We don't see how you recycle your way out of this problem. So that means redesign, reuse, all the upper R's, not the bottom R of recycling. And we want to definitely at least eliminate the most problematic and unnecessary plastics. And there's a lot of dialogue about what that actually is and means. And there's been some work globally in different spaces around defining and getting lists and that kind of stuff. But we think that's a high priority. And then we want to prevent investments in false solutions. And primarily what this means in plastic recycling is chemical or so-called advanced recycling, which is neither advanced nor recycling. It's mostly turning plastic into low-grade fuel and burning it. And so that's not recycling. So we don't want to invest, our future down that path while we could be investing in redesign, and we could be investing in reuse, and we could be investing in refill systems. And so we want to make sure that the investments that are made in really strategic ways and not sort of enabling more extraction and pollution. Finally, we want some clear reuse and redesign targets in there so that, we're really holding true to that waste hierarchy, reduce, reuse, then recycle, and not sort of going recycle or something that they want to call recycling. So those are, our top line things we want to get out of the process. As I mentioned, there's lots of other sort of nexuses within there where we feel we can have some impact. And I'll turn it back to you, Lucy.
Great. Thank you, Martin. That was great. So we're going to move to the discussion. I'm going to stop sharing for a little bit here. I encourage you to add questions to the queue using the Q&A tool. But I have a handful that we're gonna start with, and then I'll turn to those. So Martin, I know you've attended past INC meetings. Could you give us like a quick like rundown of like who the key like player groups are, and what role they're playing, like what angle they're coming into the discussions with, and then I guess the second question, how AMBR this time around was able to influence some of those discussions?
Yeah. So it's really important to understand that the only people who have actual consistent voice and vote in the process are member nations. So there are thousands of other people there who are not part of an official national delegation, and we get observer status. So there's observers and then there's delegates, and the delegates are actually, work for governments or are invited in some cases to be part of a delegation. And those delegates, it's like 180 countries or something, and they break down along very different lines, sometimes that are aligned in one way, but in conflict in another. But, you've got the small island nations, for example, who are most impacted by marine debris and maybe very tourism dependent. And, they're taking a very hard line on, we got to reduce plastics. It's destroying us, and we're not producing any of it. We're just here stuck with it, and then you've got, the major oil dependent economies and oil producers, and, they're, from their perspective, they want to produce as much as possible. They want no restrictions whatsoever. And, they have joined together in this, they call themselves the like-minded group, but there's no list, there's no official pledge. It's just when they're like-minded, and then sometimes they're not. And so it makes it very hard to respond to. And then in between those two kind of, there's this high ambition coalition, and then there's this like-minded group. And in between, there's, a whole world of developing nations who are both concerned about waste colonialism and plastics being exported and dumped in their countries. And many of them have a lot of experience with this, not only in plastics, but pesticides and toxic chemicals and electronic waste and hazardous materials and heavy metals. So they're quite savvy about how some of this minor language changes can really drive, a whole flow of stuff to their country that they don't want. And also, many of the developing nations don't want to agree to a treaty that's going to restrict their development, their economic development. Maybe they have untapped oil reserves, or maybe they have industries they want to develop. So it's very complicated. That's on the government side. So there's a whole nexus on the government side. Outside of that, there's all the business groups, and the business groups, used to be lumped together as industry. And industry included the petrochemical, oil and gas, the oil and gas companies, the petrochemical companies that process oil and gas into various feedstocks, the plastic producers, and even by that, those are like molders and the ones who actually manufacture plastic things, the brands that buy that and put their stuff in that, if it's packaging, or call upon these manufacturers to make a product that they're going, durable product that they're going to sell. Then there's the retailers, the Walmarts and the Targets and everybody else. And there's the waste management companies, or environmental management companies, of which we fall into that category in the recycling world, sort of end of life zone. So then there's a whole nexus of nonprofits, nonprofit organizations, some of whom have been involved in these kind of treaty negotiations for decades and all kinds of different things, and others who are just here for the first time, like us, on an issue that's totally relevant to them. So I hope that paints a picture of like everybody who's in the room. And it's about, 5,000 people, I think, in Busan. And then that gets broken out into these smaller working sessions, and then there's big plenaries again, and that's kind of the ebb and flow. The way that the observers have impact is by having one-on-one conversations predominantly with delegates and trying to sway different countries to adopt different positions. And so obviously we've been engaged with the US delegation and trying to get the best possible outcome from our nation, but we don't have the highest hopes for the US delegation, frankly. So we're also talking to other countries and trying to talk to them, as many recyclers are exporting scrap, whether it's plastic or paper or whatever. So, so the destination countries are particularly of interest.
Great, thanks, Martin. And then Katie, this was your first time going. I'm curious what you found, given all those different players, what you found like most surprising about the process and how like you felt AMBR was most effective in influencing people.
Yeah, I think what stands out to me the most was the process. It's the complexity and the scale of trying to align really diverse global stakeholders, the like multilateralism in action, all happening in one place, and each kind of having their own sets of priorities and expectations and levels of engagement. And I think it was both inspiring and challenging to see the breadth of perspectives coming from governments, coming from different civil society organizations and frontline communities. And I think each pushing for solutions that reflect their specific realities and their specific mission and goals. So it's really interesting to see that process unfold and the organization that it really takes to do that. I was surprised, I think, by the lack of like willingness to engage some of the observer organizations. So I think there's so much that can be gleaned there, and there wasn't really a place within the actual negotiations to get all of those perspectives to the table. So I think coming out of that meeting, coming out of this last meeting, that's a big goal, to figure out how to really get our voice in the room. I think AMBR occupies like a really unique and valuable role in this process, and we straddle kind of two environments. Like we often situate ourselves within like the industry discussions because we do play that critical piece as a member of the supply chain. We're manufacturing the feedstock that producers need to make new products. And so we approach that work though from the shared mission space of the broader environmental and social movement. So it's a really unique kind of complex place that we hold, and that dual position does allow us to act as a bridge and bringing like a very grounded perspective to policy, treaty discussions. And I think it balances that like the operational realities with the commitment that everyone's kind of trying to bring to the table about human and environmental health. So yeah, it's surprising to see it all play out all in one space and trying to get all the perspectives to the table at the same time.
Yeah, thanks, Katie. And then Alex, we should like give you a round of applause for waking up so early. Alex is based in Taiwan right now. So you've had an opportunity to work with representatives from Taiwan, working on policy and working in like, in some cases, like a pretty innovative system there. Can you share what the unique perspective that they're bringing to the table was at this last meeting, and how maybe they're aligned or not aligned with AMBR's goals?
Yeah, I mean, I think the really interesting part of experiencing, a completely other side of the world is dealing with recycling and some of the same shared goals we have is how different infrastructure and systems can be, and how that impacts, the way that AMBR looks at some of the problems. So, for instance, Taiwan has one of the highest recycling rates in the world. I think it's close to 60% nationally right now, and for some specific items, it's in the 90% for recycling rate. So, extraordinarily high recycling rate. Some of the key things that AMBR works for, Taiwan has in place, including national EPR system, where the producers and the importers are paying into a government fund that supports a really robust source separated collection method, where if you've never seen this, you should go on YouTube, but there's fleets of musical playing trucks that go on the streets in most cities, neighborhood by neighborhood, 5 days a week, and everyone comes out at the same time, 5 nights a week, and is able to recycle, I think over 20 different items, source separated, depending on what day of the week it is, all their food waste, organics, and then trash is pay as you throw. So you have to buy, a pink bag at the convenience store. Depending what size bag it is, you pay more or less. So recycling and composting is totally free. Trash costs money, and it's really this cultural phenomenon that you see your neighbors out on the curb every day, bringing your material out there, and it's there's cultural pressure to not have a big bag of trash and no recycling. Most people have tons of recycling, all their organics, and then like a tiny little bag of trash maybe, or no trash at all. So it's really this cool system that brings in participation, source separation, that keeps that material value really high, and then a really solid EPR system that includes a lot of measurements and checks all the way through the entire recycling supply chain, because the subsidies that they get, it's really dependent on the quality of material that's being collected. So those are some of the key things that make recycling so unique and special in Taiwan. And I think when it comes to the treaty, a lot of times the industry, like Martin and Katie were just talking about, the industry was such a dominating perspective at the treaty. They were the largest, they were bigger than any country's contingent of people. I think 220 fossil fuel industry people. So they'll come in, they would say, oh, well, we have the ability to recycle, or there's a capacity to recycle, but really they're not talking about collection, like what actually gets collected and brought to recycling. And that's something that AMBR really focuses on. Is it's not recycling if most of that material is still in the trash. Having a chemical recycling plant doesn't move plastic resin from the trash to the recycling stream. You still have to figure out how to get residents to participate, and you have to figure out how to collect it. And that's such an important part of the puzzle. So I think, the ability to collect material source separated in high volumes is a unique thing that happens in a lot of the world that doesn't happen in the US. So it brings up the need that, these solutions have to work under a lot of different circumstances, and people are coming at this from different perspectives. Recycle Ann Arbor right now, we're looking at how can we utilize, DRS systems to increase participation in recycling, looking at beverage circularity, deposit return systems, and how can they be modernized to really increase. So there's other ways to get that same impact through incentive-based collection methods and more community-based programs, like we all operate in terms of education and community engagement are really important. I think the other side of things, like Martin mentioned, for a lot of East Asian and Southeast Asian countries, the huge issue that they were coming to the treaty with was around ocean debris, especially like fishing gear. And a lot of the conversations that we heard there were really about, how do we develop data to be able to track where this material is ending up, where it's coming from, And so that we can, use that data to strategize on the best solutions. How do we create equitable funding mechanisms? I think Martin mentioned it's like a lot of these countries are dealing with material that they didn't generate that other countries profited heavily off of. And so how do you get equitable financing structures in place? And then there's like a lot of technology, and Taiwan is innovating on some of that technology and some of the methods of recycling. So how do you transfer the technology to the countries that don't have the capacity to develop some of that, expertise? And then finally, I think a really important issue that we were hearing, especially from Southeast Asia, where how do we, respect indigenous knowledge, and especially in the fisheries and people that have been doing this work for centuries. How do we, respect those cultural traditions and include those voices in the solutions or in leading on those solutions? So,
Yeah.
Yeah.
Great. Thanks, Alex. Yeah, so I mean, there's like obviously like real solutions that we know we know what the solutions are and like what we need to do to get there. And there's communities that are doing that and have been doing that for a long time now. Martin, I'm wondering if you can talk about like industries, sort of their I mean, I guess somewhat overwhelming presence there, and what I guess as we kind of look at what actually came out, what the actual result of INC-5 was, like what would you say industries like big wins were?
Well, I would say the most significant thing that's happened in the last couple INCs combined is that industry is no longer one thing. And so the most hopeful piece of all of this, I would say, is that the petrochemical industry and the oil and gas industry have now, to some degree, parted ways from the brands and the retailers. And that's because the brands and the retailers don't really care. They're not selling packaging. I've got just the packaging hat on right now. We're not talking fisheries or kayaks or, piping or whatever, but just on packaging, the brands don't really care. They're not tied to a plastic package. So, and they don't like all the negative play that they're getting from their customers who are saying, we don't like the plastic packaging. So brands are looking for alternatives. There was a question in here about compostable packaging, and that's certainly on the table. People are looking at that, but also reduce, refill. Like these are things that are starting to be discussed by some very serious players in the consumer goods space, Procter and Gamble and Johnson & Johnson and Mars and all those kinds of major consumer brands are they, Mandalay and Kraft, and they're all there, as are the petrochemical companies. And so what the petrochemical companies, I would say their biggest thing out of all of this is they don't want any concrete reduction goal. And there's a lot of discussion about, well, if we had a global reduction goal for production of plastic, how would we do it? What would it look like? Which countries would have to abide by that? Is that a demand problem or a supply problem? Or and so they tend to sort of gaslight the whole concept by saying, oh, it's too complicated. But that's their goal, is to prevent any kind of reduction goals. And the like-minded group led by Iran, Saudi Arabia, and Russia, they were just derailing the process and have been successful at derailing the process really since INC-2 in Paris, when they really got, like INC-1, they got really clear, holy crap, this is a big deal, and there's a lot of momentum behind it. In INC-2, they basically took 5 days of meetings to talk about whether there would be a voting process or a consensus-based process. And with a consensus-based process, which we usually like, they can block consensus on anything at any time, basically. So the oil and gas companies really like the consensus process, surprisingly. And they're tied in with these oil and gas states. Some of them, where that there is no separation between the state and the oil and gas industry, and others where you have a state that is heavily reliant on, or an economy that's heavily reliant on oil and gas production. They pretty much line up as you might expect. So that's the biggest thing, is can they get through this negotiation with no concrete goal or on reduction, and focus on circularity. They like that word a lot, because what that means is they're going to build more petrochemical plants to supposedly recycle. Chemical recycling is basically just petrochemicalizing things. It's just more, more facilities, more, those so-called chemical recycling facilities, they look just like oil and gas processing plants, that they don't look any different. So they like that, and they have been promoting that. And then, they like the idea that the brands would pay for cleanup through so-called extended producer responsibility, as long as that producer doesn't mean them. It just means the brand or the owner. They're like, oh yeah, APR will pay for circularity. Sounds great. Maybe the governments will chip in. They want to make sure they're not paying anything. And then when they talk about what Alex was saying, equitable financial mechanisms, what they're talking about is creating a government to government funding pool. They don't want to have to pay into that. There are lots of other conversations happening around legacy plastics, like what do you do with all the plastic in the ocean? Who's going to pay to clean it up? They certainly try and stop those conversations. So I don't know. I hope that gives a flavor of kind of what they're after, but it's exactly what you'd think. And I think, to Katie's point, like the most striking thing about these processes is kind of how raw it is, and how visible everybody's Machiavellian, interests are, and how, they use very nice language, but when you peel back, the fancy language, it's like, oh, they just don't want to be held accountable, or they don't want to pay. Okay, that makes sense.
Thanks, Martin. So I probably just have a question, one more question for each of you, and then we'll go to the I think there's a few questions in the Q&A, but I guess maybe we'll combine just this question. But Katie, I'm wondering if you can talk about the environmental movement and groups that are committed to reduction, like AMBR, what you felt was some of their biggest gains, and how voices of countries most impacted by plastic pollution were showing up in that space, if that makes sense. Yeah.
And I'm gonna apologize, and Lucy, tell me if it becomes too much, but I am in the office, and for some reason right now there's just a ton of we're going through our upgrade, and it's really noisy outside. So if it becomes too much,
we can't hear anything.
Flag me. Okay.
Okay.
Right now it's okay. Again, I think some might view the absence of a signed treaty at the end of INC-5 as a setback, and I think many of us who were there kind of actually view it differently. We kind of see it as a significant win, and one that I think AMBR is really proud to have contributed to. So the decision to delay finalizing the treaty, I think, really reflects the growing recognition that a rushed or weak agreement, a low ambition agreement, would be far worse than taking the extra time to craft a strong and ambitious and enforceable framework. So I think that was the impact of the movement there, is just bringing so much attention to the consequence of having a weak treaty, and making sure that all the voices were heard. There were multiple times where there was a demonstration, there was a PR event, there was public engagement through the media, and just so many opportunities for the message of the movement to get out beyond just the people in the room. And I think that was really important. And I think as we look at what is going to happen next, like we've built so much momentum and so much structure to continue doing that part of the work. So I think this last round did a lot to demonstrate the ability for the movement to bring all those voices into the room, to challenge complacency and demand higher standards and push for bolder action. So I think by holding the line, deterring this adoption of a weak treaty, like we've really created a valuable opportunity to deepen our collective impact. So I think moving forward, like this is now, like we've already jumped right back into it. I think we had like a week resting phase of where we all came back, readjusted to our time frames, and got right back into meetings. So we've got more time now to really strategize on how to work with our local governments, because the movement is global. It's not just here in the States. So folks outside of the US will also continue to engage with their governments and share information and share what we learned coming out of the 5.0 meetings. I think there's more to do in public engagement, and we really learned in this last time that that's important and impactful. So this extended timeline, it does create an opportunity for us to get more about the impacts of a weak treaty and a strong treaty out there, and then to build pressure to our local governments and our national governments to like push for ambition. Some folks might have an easier time with their governments, and sometimes some might have a harder, but this is a really great opportunity for all of us to go back to our home nations and push for that ambition. And then again, we saw the strength of our collective action, and so strengthening that collaboration, like leaning on each other, sharing the information, and just kind of like optimizing everything that we did in the past meeting to carry us through, hopefully for a much more ambitious language coming out of what could potentially be 5.1 and 5.2, and who knows how that really will all shake out. But we've heard rumblings of either 1 additional and up to 2 additional. So, and you know, there could also be more, but we're really hoping that it doesn't extend out that far, because we know that the further out this goes, the more plastic will be produced, the more plastic will be in our environment. And so we're really calling for strong and fast action.
Yeah.
Can
I wish we
add something?
go ahead, Martin. Yeah.
Yeah, I just wanted to say, like, you know, we think about the environmental nonprofits, and, you know, it's a global nexus, and some really great organizations across the globe coming to weigh in on this. And but it's not just environmental organizations. You know, when they talk about civil society, talking about sort of all the nexus of non-governmental and non-business entities, and there's a wide range of them. As you know, the U.S. has its framework, but other countries have different frameworks. But you know, the Indigenous caucus is really strong. You know, they have been through many treaties, and you know, one's had some big wins on the human rights side and in other spaces, and they're trying to bring their Indigenous voice to this this process. The waste pickers, who, you know, internationally are the folks who live on dumps and or collect recyclables in the informal sector. Some countries, they're super organized. Like there's a union of them in India. It's like 1 million people are organized. Brazil, massive. So, you know, there's those delegations, those organizations working on their delegations and trying to get the Brazilian and Indian and other countries to really pay attention to the impacts that changes at the global scale could have on waste pickers. And so there, you know, there's the health folks, and there's a caucus of scientists, and you know, there's just a whole bunch of different civil society entities out there, and groupings of them. And I would say, you know, one of the most exciting parts, at least for me, is to see when all of those are talking to each other and finding, common ground around issues and really seeing the intersectionality between health and environment and economic development and all of these different things, it becomes a pretty formidable counterweight to industry. And so, that's the part that really gets me excited. There was a moment in the last night, one of the last nights, where the indigenous folks really demanded time to speak to the whole delegation and got about half of the delegates on their feet standing in solidarity with them, saying, yeah, their voice is important and needs to be taken into account in this process. So that's, those are the moments when you really feel the power of the movement.
That's great, Martin. Thank you. I wish we could end on that, but reuse has come up a little bit, and I wanted to ask Alex. So Alex, you've done a lot of work on reuse, and I'm sure many of us saw that, like, right after INC-5, Coke eliminated their sort of voluntary commitment to 25% reusable containers, I think, by 2030. So I'm wondering, like, in the reuse space, like, and sorry, this is like, I'm throwing a new question at you, Alex, but like, what could people do, like, locally when we're thinking about reuse solutions? Because, like, we can't rely, obviously, on voluntary commitments, and the Global Plastics Treaty, hopefully there'll be some reduction targets, but like, when it comes to reuse, I'm wondering if, like, locally, if you feel like that is where some of the solutions are more focused and what those might be.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think that the super exciting thing about reuse is that it was present at the INC. It didn't make it into probably the discussions happening in the contact groups or in the just because the level of conversations were so high, but it did make it into Article 5 on product design has a reference to considering reuse. So I think there's an entryway in there, and clearly the will of the delegates with I think like almost 100 people signed on to Rwanda's proposal that demanded to consider impacts across the life cycle of plastics, and Panama's proposal to reduce production. So it's like reuse is obviously the way that we're going to get to those goals. And the thing that was amazing about reuse, to go back to your question, at the in Busan, was that it was really a lot of talk of local community groups. Gaia and Plastic Diet Indonesia and Break Free from Plastic released a report during that time called Unpacking Reuse in Asia. And it went through like a lot of really like amazing reuse that's happening right now, really community-based reuse programs, things like refill and take back programs that are targeted at like low income or middle income people, that's saving them money compared to having to use a single use sachet to buy, a lot of times, they'll move to a single use, shampoo or laundry detergent in a sachet that's not recyclable. They're moving, there's some really great programs and models of being able to refill those containers, those products, using your own packaging or using a take back packaging, or having shared utensil rentals and plate rent, cutlery rentals that are reducing the need for disposables in events. So I think, this opportunity for reuse really ties into, a lot of other issues like just transition and, indigenous rights, and in terms of really, laying out an alternative path for like a lot of the waste pickers that have been, dealing with problematic plastics, to do something, to be able to engage in this process in a more proactive and positive way, if these community-based approaches continued, right? So we've seen the corporate models in their you know, it's all about economics, of course, whereas, you know, the community models have existed in some cases for centuries that are being adopted for plastics. So I think there's a huge opportunity locally in the US. You know, we're looking right now again on the deposit return system. It's like, how can you utilize existing recycling infrastructure to facilitate reuse, right? So how can you get reuse? How can you, you know, instead of having to build an entire parallel reuse system, is there a way to leverage our recycling infrastructure to move up the hierarchy? So I think there are huge community based opportunities. And it's going to be important, just like, you know, community-based, we were talking about at the beginning of the session, community-based organizations started recycling. When it became more corporate, we started to see the problems of commingling, low quality material. And so it's like that, how do you keep that community-based ethic you know, to really have the impact focused rather than profit focused decision making that can really move the needle on diversion and environmental impact and equity issues. I think we're starting to see those conversations take place, and I think it's really exciting.
Thank you, Alex.
I know we're right at time. I wanted to hit a couple quick questions before we get to your last one.
You know what, Martin, I'm gonna just say the last one so then everyone can quickly answer it, but you go first so you can answer those questions in the Q&A first.
Okay.
But if everyone, real quick, we've got like 3 minutes left, but could just, before we close out, just share your one hope for INC 5.2. But I'm gonna go to Martin first. I know there was questions about the US delegation, like who actually that is. If there's any others you wanted to grab, go ahead.
Yeah, just on industry participation in delegations. Yeah, some countries don't have that many experts, and they invite industry to be part of their delegation. So industry is embedded in some of these delegations, and there's been a real strong effort to try and keep oil and gas out as being conflicted, having a conflict of interest. It's not gone very far to date. Tom, yeah, for sure. What Alex was just saying, state and local. It's where it's going to be, at least, you know, in the US, is our best shots. And there's a lot we can do at the local level that just makes sense. And getting some of these, you know, shop at your local refill, you know, wherever you see refill popping up, because it is, support it, go shop there. And the same with reuse. My hope, on healthcare, you know, we're trying to fight against a blanket exemption for anything related to healthcare. So yeah, there may be some necessary or, you know, important uses for plastic in healthcare, not everything. So how can we really focus on what's really critical there, as opposed, you know, essential use, as opposed to just giving them a blanket pass. And then in the US, recycled plastic probably won't be cheaper than virgin, as long as virgin is so heavily subsidized. And so that's another big discussion, is could we take the subsidies and put them into a reparations fund or a super fund of some kind, as opposed to continuing to subsidize oil and gas extraction. My hope for 2.0 is really that some of these more outspoken nations, Alex mentioned Panama and Rwanda, they got a lot of traction last time, and it was, you know, really exciting to see their impassioned pitches to the plenary floor and how many people signed on to their proposals. So I'm hoping that they are driving behind the scenes right now, driving a lot of change, and hope that that will get some real momentum as we head towards 5.2.
Thanks, Martin. Do you want to go? Katie, do you want to go next?
Sure.
Sure.
I think what all of us would probably say too is, you know, coming out of 5.2, we want to see real reduction targets and significant reduction targets, and getting a lot more concern around toxics and additives. And I think one of the talking points I heard are like talking points I heard was, you know, the getting toxics out. We don't always like know if it's toxic or not until it's out there, and so we have to stop treating like all of us humans as guinea pigs and waiting to find out if they're toxic or not. So definitely more concern and effort around getting toxics out of plastics.
Katie and Alex.
Yeah, I mean that I won't repeat. I agree with what Martin and Katie were saying. I think the one thing I'll add is just I hope that we're able to come to a new, a better process that's represents the will of the delegates. It's clear that they do have ambitions and high ambitions. Most of the countries want to see a treaty that addresses the full life cycle of plastics, and there's just a handful of states that are really holding that back. So I hope that they're able to find a process that allows the will of the delegates to move forward, and for the voices of the NGOs to be more represented and heard.
Great. Well, thank you, Katie, Alex, Martin. I'm sorry if there was confusion. It was just scheduled for an hour, but I think maybe the invite was an hour and a half. But thank you, everyone. If we didn't get to your questions in the Q&A, we'll respond to it via email. The slide here still has, we're off. We got off X, I think, officially. So we're on Instagram. Thea put our Instagram handle in the chat, but we will share out the slides and the recording, but really appreciate everyone joining us, and thank you, Katie, Martin, and Alex. Awesome. Thanks, everyone.